This is your Irish Diary, presenting the romance and reality of Irish life then and now. Áuric Éireann, or Irish Diary, is presented by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation of St. Paul. Professor John McKiernan of the College of St. Thomas of St. Paul is writer and narrator.
Interesting, isn't it, how words form associations. When one hears the word linen, almost invariably I think he thinks of Irish linen. The association has been so long. Linen has been used in Ireland, has been spun in Ireland, has been sold from Ireland for so long that perhaps unfairly to the rest of the world, the two words Irish and linen seem as though necessarily linked. I should like in this program of Irish Diary to tell you something about the industry and the uses, the romance and the reality of Irish linen. Linen, as you know, is an ancient cloth, one of the world's most ancient. If in your backyard excavation sometime you were to dig up an Egyptian mummy, you'd find him or her wrapped in anywhere up to half a mile of linen. Certainly this would suggest something of the antiquity of the cloth. But then if you are a good student of your Old Testament, you will have noted many references in there to purple, the color purple, to purple and fine linen. And these terms, you see, the color purple and the cloth linen, referred to the position, the rank, civil and ecclesiastical rank. Again, you see, attesting to the antiquity of this particular cloth. Now, if you were to continue your travels and dig up some of the ancient Irish laws, the laws that in Ireland are called Brehon laws, you would find very careful directions had been given to the Irish farmers as many as 1400 years ago for their cultivation of flax, their production of linen, and so on. In other words, you see, linen is quite an ancient cloth, and it is associated with Ireland for at least 1400 years, and possibly more than that. Until recently, we know that linen was the only acceptable cloth for men's shirts. We might have to be reminded of that in the day when we have dacron and all kinds of polyester and other fabrics. But linen, until quite recently, was the only kind of cloth that was acceptable. You may remember reading your Congreve and Sheridan, other English playwrights, or you may remember our famous Beau Nash. And when these men spoke of linen and spoke of their linens, they were, of course, thinking only of a very fine kind of fabric that was suitable for their ruffs and their shirts in general. Well, we've established the fact, at any rate, that linen has had an antique history, and it has been a cloth of fashion from Old Testament times, perhaps we should say Egyptian times, down until relatively recently. Now it's difficult to get a shirt of linen, a bit too expensive for any of us, perhaps. Now in Ireland, we have recorded documents, we have history, recorded history of the use of linen from quite ancient times, but especially from the 13th century on, we find frequent references to it, and some very interesting ones indeed. It seems to have become the cloth of the ordinary citizen, or at least the ordinary cloth of some citizens, and since it was so much associated with the Irish, it came under English censure at the time that the English were doing their utmost to stamp out all customs that were associated with Irish tradition and the stamina of the people. There were laws, for instance, directed against the way in which the Irish wore their hair. There were laws directed against facial trimmings, mustaches and beards. There were laws directed against the speaking of the Irish language. Now, all of this type of law, which attempted to wipe out anything associated with a tradition, this extended even to cloth, so that at a particular time in the history of Ireland and England, we find such curious laws as one passed during the reign of Henry VIII, in which he tried to limit the yardage of cloth to be used in a man's cloak. He thought perhaps 7 yards would be sufficient for this. Now that may sound quite exorbitant to us, until we remember that the Irish at that time were using 30 to 40 yards of cloth to make a man's cloak. Now, later in the 16th century, the English poet Edmund Spenser, who spent a fair amount of time in Ireland, you will recall, described the Irishman's cloak as a tent, large enough, at any rate, to be a tent. We have other references from the same period about women's headdress. I suppose that's a subject we oughtn't to bring up ever. But at that time, the Irish women were using 6 and more yards of material only for a headdress. And I don't think they had that, you know, teased out hair style. 6 and 7 yards simply in a headdress. Well, now, what accounts for the fact that linen has been used extensively in many, many countries for at least 3,000 years and has most often been associated with, shall we say, positions of rank and authority? In other words, has had a prestige value, or has had some such relationship as the curious fashion of the Irish to use yards and yards and yards of this cloth in their personal apparel. What has made it so important historically? What accounts for its durability and its fashion? I suppose there are several reasons. Certainly one of them must be the appearance and the texture, the very feel of linen. It's smooth. Those of you who may have real linen sheets on your bed, you know that this has a feel that's almost silk-like, except that you know it's cool in the summer and, curiously, it's warmer in the winter than cotton or the common fabrics used nowadays. So it has a smooth touch. It's lustrous to the eye. These, I think, the texture, the touch, these probably account for part of its fashion appeal. But then we know that it lends itself or accommodates itself to an amazing variety of weaves. You have the plain weaves that you have in a handkerchief, where you might say it's simply a crossing of warp and weft in a fairly even fashion. Then you have twill weaves, where the warp and weft relationships change. And then you have the satin weaves that you associate with tablecloths and sometimes with the borders along towels and so on. So I suppose this variety in its appearance, I suppose this also accounts partly for its fashion appeal. And then I would suppose that another reason that it has accommodated itself to centuries and centuries of use is the fact that it's very flexible in its uses. Not only does it have these personal uses, that is either for the person or in the household, but it has commercial uses, of course, of a very, very wide variety. The casing on high-pressure water hose, for instance, is made of linen, because linen not only is the strongest of all the natural fibers, but actually becomes stronger when it's wet. Now that doesn't happen to very many fabrics, and certainly it doesn't happen to most of the natural fibers. But linen becomes perhaps 20% stronger when it's wet. Furthermore, it swells and it closes the pores, and for hose, a commercial use in water hose, of course, it's ideal. But then it's used for parachute harnesses, it's used for mailmen's bags. You might be interested to know that the sails of the English ships that fought the Armada were made of linen sails. So it has personal uses, it has commercial uses, and it seems to satisfy a wide variety, in other words, of client. Now, like any of the old crafts, linen production was essentially a home operation. This 18th century print is quite interesting. You can see the woman on the left with her spinning wheel, and the woman in the center who's boiling yarn, and the woman on the right who's actually reeling the yarn. So that you see it was associated with the home, as any of the old crafts were. And again, from the same series of prints, you see this attic in the house accommodating the winding and warping processes for the yarn and the thread. And on the extreme left, you see the hand loom, the weaving machine. And again, from the same series of prints, we see a bleaching process. Those streaks, which appear to be imperfections, as it were, on the picture, the streaks on the hillside, are yards of linen bleaching in the sun. This was one of the very common ways of taking care of the linen. Now, these do illustrate the fact, you see, that like any of the old crafts, linen was essentially something that was done at home, father and mother involved, the children doing their share, but of course none of the technical work which we have just illustrated. Now, after the after the flax was grown by the farmer, planted by the farmer, grown by the farmer, reaped by the farmer, it went through a process known as retting, which again illustrates the home variety, if you will, the folksiness of the craft. This illustration shows us a farmer stacking the flax to put it in a retting pool, where actually what happens is rotting takes place. The fibers here must be separated from the stalk, and this is the process of retting, and it's a soaking process, and natural pools were used, whereas now things are much more commercially done. After the fiber has rotted loose from the stringy, pithy kind of binding that holds it all together, then it must be dried, and it's scotched, that is, crushed, again to make it possible to take the linen fiber away from the binding, pithy type material. And then it's combed, a process which is called hackling. Then, of course, the wife spun it, and after she had spun her yarn, she bleached it then, or it may have been bleached in the cloth. And to show the folksiness and the home craft-like operation, we ought to remind you that what she used for bleaching agents was buttermilk and a lye residue which she obtained from burning seaweed. After all of this, then, of course, the cloth was woven. And very often a man might have only 2 or 3 linen shirts in his whole lifetime. because the cloth wore so well, and of course because she didn't wear them every day. Now, that's a very quick trip over the historical romance of linen. I should like to conduct you today into a modern linen mill where things are done chiefly by machine. The flax which you see growing in the field here now is pretty to look at. It has a lovely blue or white flower, and it's pulled either by hand or by machine. Now, you'll notice when these men pull it, that they pull the root. It's absolutely necessary. This is quite different, isn't it, from so many of the plants that you know. But the men pull the root and all, because the necessary continuation of the fiber goes right down into the root. And whether it's done by hand or by machine in today's economy, it's essentially, of course, the very same process. The flax takes a great deal out of the soil. It's a hard plant. Now, it's done, as we say, in factories today, and notice how this busy factory scene leaving a linen mill in Belfast, Ireland, contrasts with the home scene that we had shown before. After we have skipped many processes here to bring you to this one, which shows the combing of the fiber. This this flax plant was crushed previous to this, and the flax fibers separated in what we call the scutching process, and they are now being hackled, that is, being combed. And notice the fine hair-like quality. It's no wonder that the description has been sometimes given of a girl that her hair was flaxen-like. It means more than just color, but it has something of the texture and the delicate draping quality of this long, continuous ribbon which you now see of flax. It's a beautiful fiber, really, no matter what state you look at it. Now, these fibers go through many, many processes, which we can't take all of your time to explain to you, but they eventually, of course, are turned into a thread. And this is twisted to give it strength, and it is a smooth thread except for the occasional natural knurls that come in a linen weave. These are quite natural to it. They're not artificially induced. These threads are woven in a variety of weaves, but perhaps the one that is best known to all of us is the damask weave, so widely used in tablecloths. Now, just before we show you the loom on which this is made, I'd like to explain there is single damask and double damask, terms that bedevil us a bit sometimes when we're looking at linens these days. But all this means is the way in which the warp and the weft are thrown together so that we have a different relationship between the threads. It has nothing to do really with the quality of the product. Although in the double damask you do have, as you see here on the loom now, you do have a finer count of threads. Now, this is what's known as a jacquard loom on which these damask tablecloths are woven. It's something like a player piano in its operation. Here the artist first paints on graph paper the design which ultimately is to be woven into the jacquard loom. She must be very, very careful to have it precisely done down to the finest measurement possible, because the jacquard loom will follow, as a player piano automatically follows what is punched out for it. So on these cards which you see before you, the jacquard loom takes its clue And now the loom is in operation, and those cards are coming in an endless stream, each of these threads operating according to the impulse or lack of it coming from one of those punched cards. This is an old form of loom. It's nothing very modern, although this particular one you're looking at happens to be one of the largest in the world. It must be tended, this one, by hand because it's so large. It has thousands and thousands of threads being shuttled back and forth during this process, and all of it automatically controlled by those punched cards. This is why we said it's something like the player piano. After the cloth has been woven, it goes through an extraordinary process where actually a sheet of flame is shot through the cloth to burn off any loose lint that might have remained on the cloth. In the center of this picture, you see the gas jets which are driving a flame through the cloth, which is rapidly spun before it. And now the cloth is being dampened in case fire might have taken hold, and now it is being unwound rather, in great lengths and wheeled away to delight some proud owner, if you will. While we're talking about the lore of tablecloths, we might mention that the 18th century was probably the high point of tablecloth development, because then they were designed to match your china. I'm afraid not many of us can afford that kind of luxury today. The processes you've been watching here now are bleaching processes. The cloth, notice how it travels just like so much rope, like miles of rope through pulleys, into the bleach and out of the bleach. No more do we have the farmer's wife with her buttermilk and lye from the seaweed, but these modern techniques now where the bleaching agent is tested by our chemists. You see this chemist has come along now to run a test upon the bleaching agent to see whether it is strong enough. A few drops of it poured into this liquid is enough to tell them. If it changes color, you see it's still sufficiently strong. So it is curious the way we have combined the old and the new. This is one of the most fascinating parts of a linen mill. Here you see the cloth is being beetled or hammered up to 400 blows a moment, and it's tremendously noisy. Just listen to some of this. Isn't that clatter deafening? Up to 400 blows a minute. Now, the damask cloths receive blows from steel hammers, and this brings out the natural gloss, believe it or not. And thus it is, you see, that linen is not only something that's beautiful in itself, but it wears well. You're not going to do this when you have it at home. This, of course, represents the sheen now that comes natural to our linen cloth. Now, this combination of the old and the new serves only to remind us that linen has been developed in Ireland, but not Ireland only, but has been developed in Ireland to a rather high degree of perfection, so that most people are inclined to associate the two words Irish and linen. Do other countries have linen? Obviously they do. Russia, France, Belgium, Yugoslavia, etc. Brazil, for instance, is making an imitation Irish linen as far as that goes. But flax is widely grown in Western Europe, and indeed the Irish sometimes have to import flax from Western European countries. They don't import it from America because the climate being different here produces a different kind of flax. Actually, our chief use for flax in this country is to produce linseed oil, so that our extensive acreage in flax is not really for the production of cloth. But in Ireland now, for we don't know how many years, but it's getting close to 2000 in all likelihood, linen has been continuously produced. How does one explain this then, when so many of the Irish industries were deliberately destroyed as a policy of England in centuries in the past? Well, it's a very simple explanation. The English feared the Irish woolen industry, for instance, and promoted linen as a substitute industry. For whatever reasons, whether they lacked the skill, which is not too likely really, or whether it was a matter of acreage, or whether it was a matter of weather, or whatever. For whatever reason, the English encouraged the linen industry and discouraged the woolen industry, so that the Irish linen industry has remained until this very moment one of the strongest industries in Ireland. As a matter of fact, the amount of yarn produced in Ireland in one day would circle the globe several times. Or to put it another way, it is the largest employer of any of the industries in Ireland. We can be grateful then that some of it is left, and we can be grateful that it was encouraged in the past. Now, the linen industry has, shall we say, become modernized in its public relations, so that I'm going to show you a curious photograph that takes place in an old Irish churchyard amidst monuments of great antiquity and great art value. Here, a modern designer has posed a young lady modeling an Irish linen evening gown. I hesitate really to bring this kind of photograph to your attention, except, I mean, after all, it is frankly promotional, but doesn't it suggest, you see, that curious combination of the old and the new? And doesn't it suggest the revival in our own times of a centuries-old Irish tradition, one that began in the homes, moved into the factory, and succeeded there in holding its own, even in our day, substituting for all of the farmer's handwork and all of his wife's handwork, all the resources of modern science, so that the dyeing, the bleaching, the beetling with those hammers and so on, all of this is done now automatically, subject to the rigid specifications of science. Our chemist enters in now, replaces the housewife, but essentially it's the same product, Irish linen, no longer requiring 30 to 40 yards for a man's cloak or 6 yards for a woman's headdress.
If you would like a list of suggested readings to add to your enjoyment, please send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Professor John McKiernan, College of St. Thomas, St. Paul, Minnesota. This program has been presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation and produced at KTCA-TV, Minneapolis, St. Paul.